How do you tend to respond when something difficult is going on within you? Do you tend to face it head on from a really grounded place and deal with it? Or do you in some way tend to avoid it? Well, today's video is all about how we use avoidance as a way to cope and the impact that it has and how to change it. So, welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm Peggy Oliveira. So avoidance is another one of the coping mechanisms that we tend to use pretty easily and pretty regularly. It's pretty natural for us to do this. One of the challenges with COVID, and there are many, is that because it caused us to kind of stop our lives for a little while, caused us to stay in, to not be surrounded by other people, maybe even not have work for a little while to distract us. It caused people to be with what they feel, their thoughts. And that's not easy for a lot of people. I would say it's not easy for most people who have a lot of difficult emotions within that they've never really allowed themselves to deal with. So avoidance is a very helpful way of coping in a lot of ways. But just like all the other coping mechanisms that I talk about, while it can serve an important purpose for a period of time, it is actually detrimental to our ability to heal and ultimately even to develop healthy coping mechanisms. Because if we continue to rely on the coping mechanisms that we learned automatically as children, then we never really have a reason or the conscious awareness to create healthier ways of being. So, avoidance is usually about distraction. Sometimes it can be, no, I don't want to think about that right now. It can also be a way to rationalize or minimize. But avoidance is often, oh, I'll deal with that later, or I don't have time for that right now. It's not a good time. We say all kinds of things to ourselves to avoid dealing with what is present within us. And part of that sometimes is we find ways to distract ourselves. So if there's something that comes up for us, we might find ourselves finding a way to be busy doing something else. And that might be cleaning the house, doing yard work, calling somebody to listen to all of their problems. It could be something that's unhealthy. Drinking, alcohol, drug abuse, sex, relationships even sometimes are ways to distract, to not to feel that thing that's going on inside of us. So again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. But like with COVID, when people didn't have all that external stuff to distract them, to keep their mind occupied with other things, they started noticing, feeling some things that maybe they've not been wanting to feel, maybe not even wanted to acknowledge was at all even close to being present for them. But when we are left on our own without a lot of things to distract us, the things that we typically use as forms of distraction, then naturally, especially in times of uncertainty, which makes us feel more vulnerable, when we feel a little bit more isolated, right? Because we're not able to spend time with people. That vulnerability generally is going to create more opportunity for what's within us to come to the forefront. And there are a lot of people who really found themselves struggling. Yes, part of it is COVID and the fear that that creates, but in reality, it's far more than that for most people. So, what do we do about it? Well, the first thing that I would say is that it can be helpful to check in with yourself periodically and just ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What kinds of thoughts have been floating through my mind today? That actually can be a really helpful and powerful exercise to do on a regular basis. It's one of the reasons that I think journaling is so important, because when you give yourself the space to really check in with yourself, then you're mindful about noticing what is really present. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy, but you can do it. What happens with avoidance is it becomes kind of a natural way of responding and reacting to things. So it becomes almost this habitual thing that we don't even recognize is happening. And the only way that we can change anything that has become habitual is to be very intentional and conscious of making different decisions. So whether it's journaling or just setting a reminder to check in with yourself throughout your day or at the end of your day, beginning of your day, just asking, what am I feeling right now? And maybe you can't name or define what that feeling is, and that's okay. But it's an opportunity to notice what is present. So if a word to describe a feeling or an emotion doesn't come up for you, that's okay. But maybe check in and notice what you feel in your body. So where do I feel something right now? Where do I feel any tension? Where do I feel any pain or unease? Are my shoulders feeling tight? Like maybe really check in with yourself and notice, are your shoulders like this? And if so, then just take a moment and let them relax. And to be very deliberate about that, instead of just saying relax, because our body doesn't necessarily just respond to that, but we can be very intentional about, okay, if my shoulders are up here, and maybe even like this, and sometimes that can happen from working on a computer or writing a lot. So maybe you just very intentionally put your shoulders back and drop them down. And just be there for even 10 seconds. It may actually feel uncomfortable. If you're not used to doing this, if you're used to being like this might actually feel really kind of strenuous in a way. And of course, we don't always walk around like this, right? But the more that we practice that, the less we're going to be like this, as long as we're doing it mindfully. Or maybe you notice tension in your jaw. How many of you really like clench your teeth together? So being mindful of what's happening within you. Maybe you notice that you're actually not sitting straight, like you're kind of leaning over the side or something. If that's the case, then you just very intentionally sit up straighter. Maybe you're slouching just generally. Maybe you take a moment to sit up straighter. If there is a feeling present, meeting that feeling with compassion. And if the timing is appropriate, maybe you just ask, what is this feeling about? And if you don't know what the feeling is, if you can't name it, it's important not to beat yourself up about that. That's okay. I sometimes have difficulty really naming exactly what it is I'm feeling, because so often we're feeling a combination of things. And especially if we don't know exactly what might have created the feeling for us, then it can be harder to really identify. So for me, if I'm feeling kind of stressed, I'll notice maybe a little bit of a constriction in my chest area, or I'll notice that I'm not breathing really fully and deeply. So that might be, for me, what I would notice. And so I would maybe say to myself, okay, I'm not breathing fully. So then in that moment, I breathe, take some very intentional breaths. And then I might ask myself, is there anything that I'm feeling worried about? Because worry is a big thing for me. Is there anything I'm worried about? Is there anything I'm afraid of? Is there anything that I maybe don't want to feel right now? And it doesn't mean in that moment that we have to feel it. It's just about practicing, giving ourselves the space to be with whatever is present. And I think for probably most of you watching this video, asking yourself, what am I afraid of? What am I worried about? And obviously fear and worry are along the same spectrum, but you might not really identify with being afraid of anything. And it's important also to recognize that fear of something doesn't mean that you're necessarily afraid that something bad is going to happen to you. It could be, I'm afraid of disappointing somebody. I'm afraid this isn't going to work out. So it doesn't have to be something really significant or catastrophic. It could be just how we talk to ourselves and what we anticipate that might be coming up. This takes practice to be able to do this. It takes practice to connect with what's present, and it takes practice to allow ourselves to feel into something. And I know for me, if there's something kind of underlying, like underneath the surface, that I'm not necessarily really conscious of, sometimes I will find myself feeling more worried, and that worry will come out as kind of agitation. For some people, it might be a desire to close down and withdraw. For some people, it might be a lot of irritability and angst about something. So if you notice patterns like that, where you tend to have a similar type of feeling that pops up quite often, you can ask yourself, what is underlying that? What's just below the surface of that? And that can help you connect with what those feelings are. So doing that regularly, and journaling is a great way to do that, because when you journal, not only are you identifying what is most present for you or what kind of most at the top of your mind, but as you continue writing, you'll find that you go a little bit deeper, a little bit further beyond what just seems to be very kind of obvious, I guess. And sometimes it is that deeper stuff that helps us really connect with what is present for us, so that we can meet it with compassion, so that upon meeting it, upon that awareness or recognition, we oftentimes just naturally begin to release it. So I know that feeling things, especially if you've experienced trauma and betrayal, tons of grief, the idea of feeling that is the last thing that you want to do. But remember that you felt most of that as a child, when you had no control over your own life, when you didn't have the developmental capacity to really process and understand. So as you allow yourself to feel difficult feelings in your adult life, you do have a different capacity within you, even if it's not yet practiced. You have a different capacity within you now than you did as a child. So while it still may not be easy to feel into the grief, the loss, the sadness, the hurt, the pain, the betrayal, whatever it is that might be there, the fear, it is a different experience now. And hopefully you have support to help you with that. And truly, when we're able to meet that feeling from a place of understanding, the feeling moves through. Previously, it got stuck a lot because we shut it down in terms of distracting, right? We would shut it down. So all that energy is still there. And then anytime you feel anything similar as in your adult life, it feels really big because that feeling is still there. So when we meet it, it begins to dissipate. So I'd love to hear from you. Can you relate to this? What ways do you use to distract? Humor is one. Withdrawal is another big one. Changing the topic of things. Sometimes, and this is particularly not healthy, I guess I would say, we might project onto somebody else. If we start to feel something that we don't want to feel, we can often project that onto somebody else in a few different ways. So how do you tend to avoid? Are you afraid of what it might mean to start feeling some of those things? This really is one of the reasons why I think it's important to work with somebody who really understands what's going on and has the capacity to be with you as you feel into those things. So, thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you have not yet subscribed, make sure you do so and click the little bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.